Thanks for being back. I got the entire left side of the room. Thank you, left side. Right side. You're close. There we go. Thank you, left side, for proving how we do it. Right side, we got some competition in the room now. So let's just get two people to share out here first. Let's go to the left side first. My left, your right. So left side, can someone share out just what you talked about? Either what you talked about or what a neighbor talked about if you don't want to share your own thoughts. Back here.
For students to have a safe, fun, engaging environment in order to learn whatever they need to so that they're well prepared for whatever lies ahead after graduation. So
really talking about the climate of the school and making sure the climate then matches whatever we need students to actually learn. If students can't learn, they don't feel safe, loved, cared about. Right. And then one person from the right side of the room. Yes, sir.
So making sure that we have quality teachers in our school system so that we have experienced educators in our classroom for our students, and creating a global curriculum for our diverse population in Mineral County. Great,
so both curriculum diversity, but also making sure that teacher quality and experience is seen across the district and the state. And I'm sure Sean will probably share this stat, but one thing the Kerwin Commission talked about was about 50% of teachers leave the profession by the third year. We're creating an environment where teaching is not sustainable and teaching is not, there's burnout, and so what the Kerwin Commission does is addresses a lot of those core issues, and Sean's going to dive deep into that, but he's going to go to the next slide first. And so the Kerwin Commission is a set of recommendations, but it's matched by a funding formula. All the recommendations are great, but if they're not funded, they don't become law. We need to make sure that the funding formula supports the Kerwin Commission recommendations. And there's three key reasons why this is critical right now. Number one, our funding formula is incredibly out of date. The last time we did this was 2002, which was 17 years ago. In that amount of time, poverty in the state has doubled. It was 22% in 2002. Last year was 44%. 44% of our public school students. I'm just going to let that number sit in the room for a second. We're operating in a funding formula that assumes 22% of our students are coming from backgrounds considered to be in poverty, when that number is closer to 50%. That's not sustainable for schools, for teachers, for principals, or for you. Second, the funding is inequitable. We haven't rewritten how we fund our schools to make sure students who need more receive more to the levels that actually allow them to succeed, whether that's because of background, special education, English language learners, or the amount of concentrations of poverty in the school that they attend. And last, 2 out of every 3 jobs are going to require more than a high school diploma by next year. Well, by 24 days from now. This is an economic crisis because we're not producing this level of certificates, degrees, and diplomas to keep up with our economic need. If we want Maryland to be able to choose our economic future, we need to produce students who can meet the demands of the 21st century. And so the Kerwin Commission was meeting for close to 3 years. They just finished on November 21st, so give them a round of applause for finishing their work. And they came back with a report that talked about how to fund it, but more importantly, what are they funding? So this isn't just about money, this is about what the money is going to be spent on, and it's these 5 policy initiatives that Sean's going to dive deep into. So when you're in the community and you talk about the Kerwin Commission, the blueprint for Maryland's future, and you talk about pre-K, Sean's going to tell you what that actually means. When you talk about college and career readiness, you'll know exactly what that means. And so these 5 policy areas, I'm actually going to start at the bottom. Because governance and accountability is key to this entire process. So we're going to start at the bottom up. Governance and accountability is incredibly strengthened under the Kerwin Commission recommendations. Where we spend the money matters, and making sure that you as a community feel comfortable with how we spend the money is going to be critical to making sure this passes. Next, more resources to ensure all students are successful, additional college and career readiness pathways, high quality and diverse teachers and leaders, and then finally, early childhood education, so making sure that we have pre-K, pre-K 3, and then birth to 5 supports. So I'm going to turn it over to Sean to dive deeper into what all of these mean. And while he's talking, think of some of your questions, because we're going to then have a little bit of Q&A time.
Great. Thank you, Joe. I'm not sure I need the microphone, but I'll try and we'll stick with it. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. As Joe said, I'm Sean Johnson, and Delegate Hinton said, I'm Sean Johnson with the Maryland State Education Association. For the better part of 2019, I had an opportunity to serve on a work group that made recommendations to the full Kerwin Commission as it related to how we build this new state-of-the-art formula. It was a position that I really took a lot of pride in and enjoyed. But the real work that got us to this point was done by Dr. Kerwin and the members of the commission. And there are two in the room that we should at least acknowledge and hear from. One is Delegate Eric Lukey, a legislator on the commission. Delegate Lukey, thank you for your work, particularly in the last year or so as we were getting to the finish line. And then for all 3 years of this work, the executive director from the Maryland State Education Association, David Helfman, who's in the room, was part of the commission as well. And if you have now not been introduced in the room, please stand and introduce your, no, just kidding. Just kidding. So, we'll only go so deep in 5 or 6 minutes here, but I do want to get through some of the policy details of each of these elements. So policy area 1 around early childhood education, you'll see on the slide here, is really about expanding access to pre-K to a near universal level for 4-year-olds, and then for at-risk, based on income level, 3-year-olds. Now, many of you might think, oh my gosh, where did we put all these pre-K classrooms in schools that feel like they are already at capacity? Well, the recommendations here envision a bifurcated system where some of these pre-K positions are supported by private providers. Now, this isn't private daycare. This is high-quality early childhood education that is run through an assessment made by the Maryland State Department of Education that reviews these private providers. So that's how we can expand quickly. Really, what you'll learn here or already know are that these recommendations are envisioned to be phased in over the next 10 years. So we don't do this overnight. Some of these recommendations will take longer than others, including getting to the 3-year-old expansion. But a very exciting way of making sure that we are preparing students to be ready to learn the moment they walk into kindergarten. Second, and this is a very policy-rich area of the recommendations, is around recruiting and retaining high-quality, diverse teachers and leaders. And this is rooted in a lot of different aspects. Everything from teacher prep programs to what we pay educators and how we staff our schools. Now, teacher prep, very important. As Joe mentioned, we have an incredible amount of turnover in Maryland public schools. It's not really unique to Maryland in terms of people who leave within the first 5 years of the profession. And sometimes that's because people come in and they know their content knowledge. They know how to teach algebra. They know how to teach U.S. history. But they do not know how to manage a classroom. Or they have not been prepared for the cultural competencies necessary, or the restorative justice practices that are needed, or the trauma-informed work that needs to be done in order to meet the changing needs of students in all of our schools. And so we need to do better at the prep side of that, and that's exactly what's envisioned here. Related to this is, that might be one reason why people leave the profession. Another is, we do not pay educators like the professionals they are. We are making progress in this regard, as Delegate Kane mentioned, through the work that the legislature had done earlier this year, but we need to make more progress. When we are recruiting from Delaware and New Jersey and Pennsylvania and Massachusetts and Virginia to teach in our schools, because we don't nearly have the number of seats in any teacher prep programs in the state of Maryland to provide the turnover necessary on a year-to-year basis. When we're recruiting, asking people to uproot themselves and come to Maryland, salary and what we pay people is a really important part of that. And so the recommendations here are, we would set a $60,000 starting salary, no matter where you worked in the state, as a way to attract people to think about entering the teaching profession. There'd obviously be differences moving up from there based on cost of living and otherwise, but as a starting place. Future pay increases would be linked to a career ladder with the idea of too many of our great teachers now think the only way I can make more money is if I leave the classroom and I move into administration. We need to remove that incentive and create an opportunity that you can make as much as your principal by staying in the classroom, become a mentor teacher. That's exactly what's envisioned through the idea of a career ladder. And then, not on this slide, but I think the third element of what goes a really long way in recruiting and retaining is just changing the dynamic of a school building based on how it is staffed. There's a recommendation in Policy Area 2 that 10 years from now, we will have 15,000 more educators working at our schools. That could help address class size, but really it could help address caseloads. It was mentioned about mental health coordinators, social workers, school psychologists. Our ratios are completely out of whack throughout the state of Maryland in this regard, and this recommendation could get us a lot of the way there. We also need certificated teachers. We also need additional education support professionals who could help with tutoring and one-on-one time, educating smaller groups of students. All of that can be accomplished by adopting the recommendations of Policy Area 2. Policy Area 3, I think, is a really exciting part of this work. And it gets at the economic development aspect of this, because getting your high school diploma needs to mean something. It means you are ready to go to college without having to pay for a bunch of non-credit bearing classes because of the need for remediation. But it also means, and that's important, Maryland's been at the forefront of leading the conversation about college affordability and expanding for dual enrollment and early college opportunities. That's great. We need to continue that work. These recommendations do. But I think what's really different here is that the Commission said, you know what, talking about college affordability is very valuable, but we also need to talk about how it can be affordable if you don't go to college, if that's not your pathway. What is the job trait, the skill, the certification that you can walk out of high school either having or very close to having, because we have changed and rethought this high school experience. All of that, very exciting, I think, and the career technology education expansion is part of Policy Area 3. Policy Area 4 gets to the point of how inequitable our funding formulas are now. This is the root of updating a funding formula. Currently, Maryland schools are funded on a per-pupil basis. There's additional money based on how many students receive or on free or reduced price meals, additional dollars if a student is receiving English language learner services or special education services. In all three of those categories, there is additional dollars, significantly more dollars invested in the proposed new funding formula. Significantly more, particularly in the area of special education, which is vital because the federal government doesn't keep up its end, and frankly, we've had a hard time really making ends meet as it relates to special education needs. But the new element, and it gets to exactly what Delegate Hinson was talking about the school we are in, is this element around concentration of poverty. We know there are different challenges for educating students when they come from poverty, and they are even more challenging when you have a concentration of those students in one building. And so if that becomes a community school where we identify and leverage county resources and nonprofit resources and the like in a school building to help address some non-academic factors that impact academic outcomes, that's exactly what we can do with expanded wraparound services of community schools. And we create those through this concentration of poverty grant. Now, there are two in Anne Arundel County now based on the work that was done this past year. At full implementation, this is a grant that would support schools with 55% or more of their students on free and reduced price meals. And under the existing data, there are 22 of those schools in Anne Arundel County. Sadly, it's projected to grow. Anne Arundel County had the second highest growth rate of any jurisdiction in the state of students receiving free and reduced price meals between 2018 and 2019. And so this is a crisis that this element of a revamped funding formula can really disproportionately help Anne Arundel County Public Schools. Fifth, and Joe started with it, and I'm glad he did, because it is a critical element of this, is we cannot have an honest conversation with taxpayers and students and educators in this state without talking about how these new investments also come with it new governance and accountability aspects. Because when elected officials make budget decisions to invest more dollars for early childhood education, you'll never guess this, people actually expect you to expand early childhood education access. And when we say we're going to have more dollars for career technical education pathways, lo and behold, people expect to see that. And so that's part of this accountability, that when we invest these dollars, this is what we're going to see. We also know, because these recommendations are rooted in the highest performing systems around the globe, that when we do these things, student outcomes will improve. And all of those things link together, plus an element that Governor Hogan really led on and the General Assembly supported in 2019 to make sure that we are not looking at incidences of waste, fraud, and abuse associated with education funding, was an adoption of an Inspector General provision. That was done in 2019. We're actually still waiting for the governor to appoint that person. But there are elements of this that really do beef up and expand the accountability aspects of our public schools. That's the quick, I guess longer than I probably had time for, overview of the 5 policy areas. And I think I hand back to Joe for any questions that folks have on these or otherwise. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. So, just before we do 1 or 2 questions, just want to let you know, you're going to have time to dive a little bit deeper into these in a smaller group setting. So if there's a burning question or 2 burning questions, we'll have time for that. But by a round of applause, how many people heard something that they really liked? How many people heard many things that they really liked? And how many people are ready and willing to start fighting to make sure that this happens in our public schools? So that's what today is about, and that's what you're going to hear about soon. But let's make sure you have a chance to ask some of those burning questions. We have time for about 2. Is there a question? It's by show of hands. Yes, sir. Hi, George.
I started teaching in 1960 when the dinosaurs were still around. And when I started teaching the people that were giving us curriculum material to teach kids with, they were very cognizant of the fact that we're supposed to teach the kids how to adapt to their environment right now. But they also try to anticipate what the environment was going to like 10, 20 years from now when the children grew up and they were going to be in a different environment. And I don't see any of that anticipation in this, really. It sounds like it might be in there, but I'm not sure I hear it.
Okay. So,
I'm not finished.
all right.
I was walking around BJ's the other day, and I was looking at everything that was on sale there. And I noticed that everything on sale there was made in China. And I thought to myself, if everything in the store is just about as made in China, that means when I buy a product made in China, I'm not employing an American. I'm employing a Chinese, which I don't have anything against the Chinese, but I would like to employ an American making the product. And I also thought, well, that means that the engineers that would be living in the United States, they're also being de-skilled because they're not designing the product, they're not guiding the production of the product. So I'm thinking in the future, we could be in a lot of trouble. I was talking to a BGE home guy who said, we can't find tradesmen who can do jobs. We're killing ourselves working too many hours. And we're making fantastic money, there's still money to be, but there's nobody out there that has the skills. And I'm putting 2 and 2 together, and I'm thinking the future doesn't look very good for Americans, workers. And it might be great to have a lot of degrees, but if we can't get somebody to fix something in our house that needs fixing, because we lost the skills.
So, first of all, can we give George a round of applause for your service as a teacher since 1960? Thank you for your service. So let me try and summarize, because I think you hit on a lot of really good points that might be more than a 1 or 2 minute answer. So we'll stick around after and have more of an in-depth conversation. So Sean, if you could talk about both the CT pipelines, about how we'll make sure students that graduate from Maryland public schools are then able to instantly contribute to the Maryland economy. And then the second part would just be, is this future ready? Or in 2030, is all of this just not worth it anymore?
I'll try. I was hearing your first part of your question around are teachers prepared, or getting themselves prepared for what students of the future are going to look.
That's our curriculum to prepare students for the future.
Right.
In the future, according to what's happening to us right now, doesn't look very bright. How are we addressing that? We need to not just get more and more degrees. We have to have
Well, so there is, I would say in this policy area 3, around expanded college and career-ready pathways, it's not designed to be prescriptive that says every school district is going to have this set of skills or partner with this trade associate, trade union, or whatever, so that we increase a specific pipeline of professions. But we know, just because there are already fairly robust career technical education programs in Anne Arundel County and around the state, that this takes a lot of different shapes and forms. I don't think we legislate by anecdote, but I'm going to answer your question by anecdote by talking about my own experience with CTE because of my 2 kids. So my daughter went through a CTE program, and it was an engineering program. And it was specifically geared towards the very jobs that I think you're speaking about, that maybe we even recruit from overseas to fill in the United States, of going through a college program specifically to have that degree. That was in a public high school in the state, and I think was a really tremendous program that prepared her for college. My son, on the other hand, was in a CTE program, but it was around collision repair programs. That was not a college path, and he had no intention of going to college. But it was a specific skill and trait that he could come out and fill a job in our community the day after he graduated high school. And so that's exactly the type of CTE expansion that is envisioned here. When I was we've done about 30 of these community forums around the state over the last few months, and I was in Cecil County up at the corner of Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Maryland, and their whole career technical education expansion was around agricultural support, because that was exactly what that community needed. And I think how these programs partner with local community college and local employers is going to look different in all 24 jurisdictions, but it is designed to specifically create the pipeline of jobs of today and the future.
And so we have a hard stop at 3 for our Q&A. So does anyone have a question that can be answered in 1 minute or less? I'm going to go back here in the blue. Please lead with your question.
The question is, when people ask, what can we tell them the origin of the increase in poverty in public schools from 22% to 44%? Is that people of higher income leaving the public schools because they didn't have faith in it? General economics, what's driving that increase?
So, a couple of things. General economics would be one. This mirrors a national trend. Nationally, it's about 50%, so Maryland's actually slightly below the national average. And then just to push back on some of the rhetoric of people of high income are leaving the state or fleeing. A report actually came out, I think it was this morning. Maryland has the highest concentration of millionaires of any state. So the wealth exists, but it follows general economics of the rest of the nation that just hasn't recovered from 08. So 3 o'clock exactly. So it's a much longer answer that we can talk about, but that's a much longer answer. So thank you so much. Sean and I are going to turn it over to Camille Dupleshay, a student in Anne Arundel County Public Schools. So give it up.